Okay, it is now an honor and a privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, Lulu Garcia-Navarro. You may know Lulu and recognize her smooth voice as the recently departed host of National Public Radio's Weekend Edition Sunday. She spent 5 years doing that before joining the New York Times in October to anchor a new podcast for the opinion side. You may not know that Lulu had an illustrious and exciting career as a foreign correspondent, and a highly decorated one at that. Like many correspondents, she started out as a freelancer, in her case for the BBC World Service and Voice of America, covering stories in Cuba, Syria, Panama, and Europe. She then was hired as a producer and correspondent for AP Television and AP Radio, and they sent her to cover events in Kosovo, Colombia, Afghanistan, Israel, and Iraq. She joined NPR in 2004 as Mexico City bureau chief, and over the next 12 years, she was sent to Baghdad, Jerusalem, and Rio de Janeiro to oversee NPR's coverage. So anyone who has hopscotched around the world like that, you know those are some of the toughest spots in journalism. She covered the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the 2011 Arab Spring uprising. In fact, Lulu was one of the first reporters to enter Libya as the uprising was gaining strength. Her coverage won numerous accolades, including the OPC's Lowell Thomas Award. When she became the host of NPR's Sunday morning news magazine, she was the first Latina to helm a flagship NPR show. Her new assignment at the New York Times seems a perfect fit. It involves exploring how people come to believe what they do and what happens when their beliefs are tested. Or to quote Lulu, where lived experience and opinion intersect. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lulu Garcia-Navarro.
Good evening, and congratulations to all the winners. I'm especially pleased to be here tonight celebrating with my former employers, NPR, and my current ones, the New York Times, as they are both shining examples of excellence in their international coverage. I want to also give a special shout out to my former colleague, Phil Reeves, sitting right over there, I'm going to point at him, who told me when he found out that I was going to be the keynote speaker that, quote, he thought to himself, bah, I already know what she thinks about things. There's a saying in Spanish, nadie es un profeta en su propia tierra, which means no one is a prophet in their own land. And our friends keep us humble. Thank you, friend. This is, of course, a night of celebration of the complex and necessary work that we have all done. And the journalism that you do is all vital and it's risky. I am thinking especially tonight of the families of the journalists recently killed in Ukraine and of all of those tonight in harm's way, not just in Ukraine, but in so many places around the world. The stories we tell, the stories that we're seeing tonight are often so hard. And when I was asked to address you initially, and this was before the war in Ukraine, my first thought was to take a lighter look at the work of international reporting, because while we tackle so many important weighty issues, we all know that there's so much that is funny that happens while we're out in the field. And I know this seems ridiculous now, Lulu, read the room, but this was really my initial thought. I was like, I'll tell some jokes. And I was thinking about this in particular because whenever I see a group of friends of mine from another former employer, the Associated Press, we always bust out laughing about how we bought a beat-up 1991 Humvee, a relic of the first Gulf War, to get us from Kuwait into Iraq in the second Gulf War. It was 10 years old, and it died right on the border smoke billowing from its rusted engine as the US Army rumbled past us, and we sat there having to wait and wait for a tow to get us back to Kuwait City. It was humiliating, it was infuriating, it is now hilarious. Why did we buy a defunct US military Humvee that had been left in the Gulf? I don't know. It seemed like a stroke of brilliance at the time. It was not a stroke of brilliance. It was not. And I was just speaking to another friend of mine who came back from the reporting in Ukraine, and she skirted away from some of the difficult issues. See, I'm short. She skirted away from some of the difficult issues, and we told more funny stories about cars and misunderstandings. And it occurred to me that we were enacting a time-honored tradition among journalists who cover hard things. Touch lightly on the horror in order to cope. It's far easier to talk about the mundane or the absurd when we're suddenly thrust out of the violence and insanity of tragedy. It's easier to do that than to process what we've just seen and experienced. Tell a joke, an anecdote, and maybe we can think about it differently, maybe not make people uncomfortable with our painful stories. So I was going to do that. I was going to tell a story about war. It can be funny, right? Hilarious. It's a way that we try to deal with what we now know are the serious strains to our mental health in this job. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight, because I think here as journalists, we often tell other people's stories. That's what we're tasked to do. But we don't think about and talk about what happens to us when we tell these stories over and over again. I want to acknowledge that there can be a perceived shame to even talk about journalists' mental health when people are being slaughtered, when the problems of the world, so aptly highlighted in all the coverage honored tonight, is ongoing. Why should we talk about the mental anguish of journalists who choose to cover these things instead of highlighting the suffering of those who are the victims of circumstance? When I was first diagnosed with PTSD, it was a few years into the Iraq War. I had at that point been continuously covering the conflict. I had been in Afghanistan, Israel, Palestine during the Second Intifada. I was living in Iraq, witnessing their unfolding civil war. And I began to notice that while I was in Iraq, I felt fine. I felt centered. I felt totally in control. It was only when I left that suddenly the panic attacks would come. I'd be walking down an American city, and I'd feel a sense of dread, like something terrible was about to happen. I withdrew from social occasions. I was angry. Life felt flat. I only felt fully alive when I was in mortal danger. Back then, we didn't talk about those feelings to our peers and much less to our bosses. Stories started coming out about PTSD in American soldiers, but it took a while for journalists to see that maybe this condition applied to them too. And eventually I did seek treatment quietly. I'd seen that journalists who had publicly acknowledged their struggles had been sidelined in other organizations or worse. So I was given advice to sort of process it, like previous conflict reporters had done, through drinking at the bar and telling funny stories, and I did that. I became a kind of accidental advocate on journalists and mental health. One of my friends in Iraq wrote one of the first articles on the subject, and I gave her an interview on my experience. And I didn't really realize that things that get written in major publications follow you around. Who knew? Because it was then novel to talk about it. It made it onto my Wikipedia page. I have one. Then people wanted to interview me about it. And I was asked about it in job interviews, too. And as I started talking more and more about post-traumatic stress disorder, I realized that the stigma was never going to go away if I wasn't prepared to talk about it openly and honestly. We've come such a long way since then. Most reputable news organizations have some kind of support for the mental health of their staff. And that can include therapy. That can include peer networks and crisis hotlines. Managers are now sending out emails about taking care of yourself. Mental health breaks, especially after the pandemic, are now a thing in some places, and this is all incredibly welcome. And I'm getting somewhere with this. But here's my second story about mental health. Because we all know that war zones are the most extreme places that you can be, but the mental health issues of journalists don't only come from there. Lots of therapy and many conflict zones later, I was the host of a national show when the pandemic hit. And I worked in an office. I didn't work in a battlefield. But suddenly the world stopped. We became isolated. And meanwhile, in my job, I felt I had to filter all the grief and the fear and the pain of the whole country. My own community of Latinos was being hit incredibly hard by COVID. I felt like I had a mission to help, and I poured myself into it, because that's what we do in a crisis, right? We kind of bear witness, we explain, we help people understand what is happening. It gives us meaning. And things just got worse and worse. I was having conversations through my job with grieving families, with people who had lost their jobs. I was going into pediatric ICUs where children were close to death, and it took its toll incrementally. Over time, things got darker and darker, and by last summer, I was in a full depression. And despite all the help that was ostensibly available to me, it is true that when you are suffering from a mental health crisis, you are often not in the right frame of mind to help yourself. You think you can write it out, that somehow it will get better, and again, there's this shame. And I'll say I felt it tonight when I was coming up here to talk to you. This shame in admitting that you are suffering when the whole world is suffering, and many so much more than you. So I'll ask this question again: why would I be talking tonight about the mental health and the mental anguish of journalists to you all? Because I'm thinking right now of a new generation of journalists for whom Ukraine will be their first conflict. I've been talking to some of them. And I'm also thinking about those of us who have seen conflict and tragedy many times. Some of you are here tonight. It actually doesn't matter when it comes to how we cope with our jobs, how much experience you have or don't have. Even for someone like me, who had researched and been treated for PTSD, it seemed ridiculous to complain or confide last year about what I was feeling, especially to my colleagues who were also going through their own struggles. And as journalists, we bear this particular burden to continue to absorb and process the pain we see, but to also be dispassionate and impartial too, to talk to a mother who has just seen her child murdered, to a family who's lost everything, and then to write about it, and the next day to do it all again, to pretend that everything's fine when it may very well not be. I just want to leave you with this thought. I am here to tell you that it is normal to have the very human response of feeling pain, of suffering, when you report on suffering. You can get help and feel better. Eventually, I did and do feel better. I made constructive changes to my life. So as I want to impart this message to us journalists first, which is, as we embark on this very uncertain year, make sure you are taking care of yourself. Make sure you are supporting your colleagues who may need help. Reach out and get the help you need, even if it means simply confiding in a friend. Because I've been so public about my experience, I've had many, many journalists reach out to me over the years to talk about what they're experiencing, and it has helped them understand a lesson I keep having to learn, which is, do not suffer alone. And to our news leaders, please remember that our minds can be as vulnerable as our bodies. We have gotten very good at flak jackets and physical safety protocols, but what actual protocols do we have in place for someone who needs mental health help, including freelancers? Are we preparing journalists before they go somewhere difficult for what they may experience mentally. We all do hostile environment training that looks at what to do if a bomb goes off, but I've rarely heard anyone talk about the mental strains of this work before you undertake it. And how can we support local journalists who may be experiencing trauma in a completely different way? It has been some time since news organizations have had to staff a sustained and brutal conflict like the one in Ukraine. And I can tell you it will take its mental toll. But remember, it is not just war that can wound us. As exemplified in the incredible work tonight, journalists are constantly interacting with crisis and trauma. So as the world is entering this dangerous new era, we must cover it, but we must also take care of the minds of the people who are also covering it. And so, no joke, congratulations to everyone, and thank you.